Next on Secrets of War. Hitler's lightning strike in Poland soon gave way to a strange 8-month waiting game. Blitzkrieg became Sitzkrieg, an assassination plot, secret peace talks, and captured invasion plans could have drastically shortened the war and saved millions of lives. But heroes were in short supply. Sitzkrieg, the Phony War, is next on Secrets of War.
On the 1st of September 1939, the German army poured over its eastern border into Poland. The reason for their attack, a raid by a handful of Polish soldiers on a radio station in the German border town of Gliwice. But Poland had not drawn first blood. The raid was a sham. Members of the Nazi Party intelligence service had secretly dressed a few prisoners in civilian clothes and shot them at the station. Then dressed other prisoners in Polish army uniforms and shot them in the nearby forest to suggest that the attack had been repulsed.
It would appear that the Poles had committed a minor atrocity by shooting some German border people, etc. A cruel trick, to say the least, and one that I don't think impressed anybody in the world.
The Blitzkrieg's motorized divisions quickly defeated the hopelessly outdated Polish cavalry units on horseback. The French and British governments declared war on Germany, but their ground forces failed to move. Allied aircraft outnumbered Germany's Luftwaffe, but there were no raids over Germany. As Adolf Hitler's troops continued their rapid advance from the west, Joseph Stalin's Soviet army sealed Poland's fate in just 3 weeks by advancing from the east and claiming their half of the spoils. From these events emerged a curious period known as the Sitzkrieg, or Phony War. An 8-month span of time from the end of September 1939 to the beginning of May 1940 without battles. A time filled with both great hope and profound frustration.
The Sitzkrieg was a strange time of waiting. It was a time of relative indecisiveness. A time where war plans kept getting postponed, where primary politics still could have gotten the upper hand at any time.
Hätte die Oberhand gewinnen können.
There were lots and lots of missed opportunities during that time, both for the Allies to knock out the Germans and also for the Germans to take control of Europe.
British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and French Premier Edouard Daladier had failed to negotiate a peace settlement. With memories of bloody World War I battlefields and millions of casualties still fresh in their minds, they wanted to avoid war at all costs. Hitler had broken agreement after agreement by occupying Austria, Czechoslovakia, then Poland. Despite France and Britain's declarations of war and their promise to support the Poles, they still seemed reluctant to engage the enemy.
They were very afraid that if they sent troops and sent bombers over against Germany, that their countries would also be bombed, and they were not ready for it. However, the real problem was the speed at which the Germans advanced into Poland. And once the Russians came in, it was clear to the Allies that they would not even be able to help Poland, even symbolically. And so therefore they did almost nothing.
67-year-old General Maurice Gamelin, a divisional commander in World War I from a traditional military family, was the overall commander of the joint British and French forces in France. Drawing from his experiences in the Great War, he was content to sit behind his country's state-of-the-art series of fortifications, known as the Maginot Line. Construction began in 1930 and was completed 7 years later at a cost in today's money of more than $2 billion. The series of anti-tank defenses and heavily armed forts stretched for 87 miles along the French-German border. The larger structures could house 1,200 men for 3 months without being resupplied.
The generals at the time, even the soldiers at the time, were still carrying the mental and the physical scars of these horrendous, bloody, slogging matches of the Western Front.
Because of this defensive mentality, one of the greatest missed opportunities of the war occurred even before the Phony War began. During the Polish campaign, all of Hitler's best soldiers were involved in this invasion far to the east. The defenses on the border with France were sparsely manned with poorly equipped second-rate troops. The Fuhrer had insisted on attacking Poland before the German military was completely ready. General Gamelin ordered just a few divisions of French forces on Germany's western border to advance into Germany, avoiding casualties whenever possible, even if it slowed progress.
They met a little bit of resistance, but not much. And then almost inexplicably, he drew them back. And to this day, there had not really been a good explanation for why he did that, except timidity, except a refusal to believe that this was a real war, even though war had been declared, even though Poland was being destroyed. And had they taken the offensive and moved into Germany, the war would have been completely different.
Since France and Britain refused to launch a full-scale attack and were indeed unprepared to advance, even if they'd wanted to, the next great mystery of the Sitzkrieg became where and when the Germans would attack the Western powers. After an overwhelming victory in Poland, Hitler turned to his generals for advice on how to invade France and the Low Countries. The code name for the invasion was Case Yellow. But the Nazi war machine needed time to rearm and redeploy to Germany's western border. Certain high-ranking officers also thought this invasion would eventually destroy Germany. They tried to delay the offensive as much as possible, and they devised an intentionally uninspired plan to ensure defeat. German Army Intelligence Chief Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, Army Commander-in-Chief General Heinrich von Brauch, and Army Chief of Staff General Franz Halder were all part of this subtle resistance movement.
The initial plan that Germany had for the invasion of the West was based on the old Schlieffen Plan, which had worked in World War I. And it involved a huge mass of troops on the northern border of Germany coming down through the Low Country and into France. It's sort of like a hinge.
This was exactly the type of attack for which France and Britain were prepared. They knew the Germans wouldn't attack directly from the east because the vaunted Maginot Line presented too strong a barrier. Just north of this lay the Ardennes Forest, which the Allies felt was too thick to provide passage for a major invasion force. For General Gamelin, the only logical opening and the only invasion route he prepared for was further north through the relatively flat, open terrain of northern Belgium and Holland.
Gamelin had determined to bring his forces up to the north, what he called La Grande Manœuvre de la North. And he was waiting to do this. He would say at dinner parties, when am I going to be able to do this grand maneuver?
Gamelin enjoyed gourmet meals in his headquarters as he confidently waited for his chance to counter the German attack. For the French troops who'd been called up to the front, this inactivity was demoralizing. 34-year-old Jean-Paul Sartre, one of the great philosophers and writers of the 20th century, had been assigned to a meteorological section assisting an artillery unit near the German border. The growing psychological toll of the Phony War was obvious to him. Sartre wrote in his diary, "My work here consists of sending up balloons and then watching them through a pair of field glasses. Afterwards, I phone the battery artillery officers and tell them the wind direction. What they do with this information is their affair. The young ones make some use of the intelligence reports. The old school just shoves them in the wastebasket. Since there isn't any shooting, either course is equally effective." The French troops may have been sentenced to boredom by their leaders, but there was plenty of activity on other fronts during the Sitzkrieg. Peace negotiations took place between the Allies, particularly the British government, and the anti-Hitler, anti-war German officers throughout the Phony War. Pope Pius XII's Vatican City was the site of much of the dialogue between the two parties.
The proposition they put to Pope Pius XII was, you've seen Poland, you've seen what happened to a Catholic country. Now, is it going to happen again? Or will you work for peace? Will you help us, the German resistance?
The principal figures in these negotiations were British Ambassador Sir Darcy Osborne and Catholic German resistance member Dr. Joseph Müller. Müller was friends with many top Vatican officials, including the Pope. He knew he risked execution for his involvement in the negotiations, but Müller was committed to ridding Germany of the Nazi Party.
Die Wünsche der deutschen Militäropposition wurden.
The German military opposition's desires were brought to Pope Pius XII. The Pope then, in turn, spoke with the British ambassador Osborne, and Osborne carried the German conspirators' ideas further to London, to the British government.
Weiter nach London zur britischen Regierung.
Some progress was made, but all of the proposals required the removal of Hitler from power. The German resistance had been planning a coup against the Führer. However, it was becoming difficult to muster support as Hitler enjoyed one military victory after another. Britain waited for the conspirators to oust the Nazi leader, while the resistance members waited for the Allies to offer assurances that they would not take advantage of Germany during this vulnerable time of inner turmoil.
Regrettably, and this is often the case through all these negotiations that one sees, nobody was really prepared to put their neck on the line.
These tentative talks caught the attention of the Nazi Party's intelligence branch, known as the SD, when someone mentioned them to a monk who also happened to be an SD agent. Without strong support from the Allies, and because of the very real threat of being exposed and executed, momentum for the coup faded. As a high-ranking officer, Chief of Staff Halder was allowed to carry a pistol into meetings with Hitler. Many times he'd thought about shooting the Nazi leader, but had been unable to pull the trigger. It seems that German military tradition did not inspire radical, revolutionary thinking.
They really did not have what it takes to conduct assassination and coups. One of the officers said, I regret to inform you that nothing in my background has prepared me to assassinate someone.
The German opposition didn't keep their promise that they would overthrow Hitler. And the British government held back in encouraging the German opposition. So we had this phenomenon that neither side understood the other very well. And because of this, perhaps an opportunity was missed.
Besides the members of the German resistance, the commander of the German Air Forces, or Luftwaffe, Hermann Goering, tried to negotiate a peace several times. Through friends from neutral countries, he seemed quite comfortable discussing Hitler's dismissal and his rise to ruler of Germany. But the Allies never felt that they could trust Goering. He may have simply been trying to obtain information from the Allies for the coming battle. He also seemed more interested in preserving his luxurious lifestyle than truly achieving a lasting peace for his country. During the peace talks in the fall of 1939, the German army had come perilously close to invading, as prearranged start dates had been postponed for a variety of reasons. Just as General Gamelin's forces had missed an opportunity to act boldly by invading Germany during the Polish campaign, both sides in these various peace talks had behaved tentatively and failed to avert the approaching battle. Another event was about to make any further peace negotiations even more difficult. Major S. Payne Best and Captain R. Henry Stevens were two of the most senior British intelligence field agents in Europe. In Amsterdam on the 30th of October 1939, Best and Stevens met with two Germans who introduced themselves as Captain Schammel and Captain Hausmann. Dutch police had intentionally stopped the men at the border. They and the British were satisfied that their papers seemed to validate their identities.
The British were not well informed because they were so desperate for information and because they were ideologically prepared to believe anti-Nazi speech.
Several more cautious meetings took place in various Dutch cities during which peace proposals were discussed. The two Germans were even given a wireless radio set so they could communicate with the British. But then an event which took place hundreds of miles away in Munich drastically changed these talks. On the 8th of November, a bomb intended to kill Hitler exploded shortly after he'd left a building where he'd made a Nazi Party speech. The Führer suspected that British intelligence, also known as MI6, was behind this attempt on his life. On the 9th of November, Stevens and Best were heading by car to the Café Bacchus in the Dutch border town of Venlo to meet the two German captains. However, one of the supposed resistance members was actually Walter Schellenberg, an important member of the SD. He'd been ordered to put an end to this cat-and-mouse game to see what MI6 knew about the Munich bombing. Suddenly, two cars filled with SS agents crashed over the border, trapped the British agent's car, pulled the agents into their own cars, and sped back across the border into Germany. A Dutch agent working with Best and Stevens was killed in a gun battle in a nearby forest during the operation.
They interrogated them quite thoroughly with all the trappings that the Gestapo can bring to bear, and managed to get from them a pretty good rundown of the whole British intelligence network. On the eve of shooting war, this was no time to lose their eyes and ears, but the British did.
They didn't find any evidence that MI6 had been involved in the assassination attempt. That didn't matter. Stevens and Best were still linked to the crime by Joseph Goebbels, the head Nazi propagandist. Besides being an embarrassment for British intelligence, the Venlo incident caused the Allies to be less trusting and more wary of genuine peace offers from German resistance members. Once again, strange twists of fate seemed to be leading Europe closer to a long and bloody war. Just a few days before the Venlo incident occurred, a mysterious package was discovered on a stone ledge outside of the British Embassy in Oslo, Norway. It was addressed to the British naval attaché. When he opened it later that morning, he discovered technical drawings about some type of weaponry and a card signed by a well-wishing German scientist. No explanation was included. The package was quickly forwarded to London, where R.V. Jones of MI6 was assigned to examine it. The fact that he'd just completed a report on the current state of the German weapons program made him the perfect man to inspect these papers, which came to be known as the Oslo Report. It seemed to provide details on advanced rocket, jet engine, and torpedo and radar programs.
The Oslo report was so stunning that initially it was looked upon as disinformation. None of this could be true, because if it were, the Germans would be so far advanced that we would not be able to wage war against them.
For many people in the Allied camp, the Oslo report was a wake-up call. Jones's judgment that these advanced military programs were real was eventually confirmed when some of these weapons were captured later in the war. The identity of the well-wishing German scientist remains a mystery to this day. Very few people would have had access to so many different secret weapons programs. Abwehr Chief Wilhelm Canaris and an engineer working at the Siemens factory in Germany are two of the primary suspects, but the debate still continues. Bad weather and stalling tactics by the officers of the German resistance had continually postponed the invasion of the West. Then, on the 10th of January 1940, with the next planned invasion date just 1 week away, the Allies had another stroke of good luck, or at least it appeared that way at first. A Major Helmut Rheinberger was flying to an important meeting in Cologne to discuss the final details for the invasion. He should have taken a train the night before, but he was having too much fun at the base officers' club in Munster. Another major offered to fly him the next day so he could enjoy the party. They started off for Cologne with sunny skies, but fog soon set in. The two officers became lost, and Rheinberger began to panic. He was carrying secret plans for the invasion, which were never supposed to be brought in a plane precisely because aircraft can stray off course. They finally spotted a river and assumed it was the Rhine, which runs through Cologne. But while trying to locate the city, they ran out of fuel and crashed in a field. Local police quickly arrived at the scene.
It was almost like Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz saying, "Uh-oh, Toto, I don't think we're in Kansas anymore," because they landed and people were not speaking German and they knew they were in trouble.
The river they'd seen was the Meuse, or Maas, not the Rhine. The Germans had landed near the town of Mechelon on the Belgian-Dutch border. The officers and the invasion plans were taken to the nearby jail. Hitler was furious when he heard that the plans for Case Yellow had been captured. But the Allies did little with the information. General Gamelin took the news as confirmation that his grand maneuver in the north would be a success and that his defensive positions were well chosen. The Allies could have used these plans, revealing the locations and strengths of most of the German divisions near the front, to launch a preemptive attack of their own. But only defensive measures received consideration.
Everything that accommodated the government's policy in France, as in England, was a defensive, a neutral, a cowardly, vile policy. Everything that went in that direction was welcomed, and everything against that was always denied.
On the surface, the Allies seemed to have an advantage. In reality, capturing the plans for Case Yellow actually worked against France and Britain. Hitler had not been pleased with his general's unimaginative and cautious plan. Now he had a reason to change it. Lieutenant General Erich von Manstein had been advocating a different strategy, but his memos to the general staff had been filed away by resistance members. Finally, he came face to face with Hitler and told the Führer his idea.
Manstein, being a man of a slightly different generation, certainly innovative in terms of his idea of what mechanized warfare could do, had a much more precise and a much more potent thought about the strategy to be applied in the West.
The German army group in the north was to wave the red matador's cape at the Allies and provoke them into storming forward like an angry bull into the trap. Then the panzer divisions concentrated in the Ardennes would stab at the Allied flanks, like the matador wielding his sword.
A May invasion date was set, but a smaller operation was scheduled to begin even earlier. Besides the Russian invasion of Finland, the Battle of Norway was the only major military action during the Sitzkrieg. Like all other aspects of the Phony War, this battle was riddled with lethargy and missed opportunities. For months, the British had been contemplating an invasion of neutral Norway in order to cut off Germany's supply of iron ore, the basic metal used to manufacture many different weapons. Germany had also considered an operation there in order to protect their supply.
Norway really is something that shouldn't have taken the Western Allies by surprise, but certainly did.
Even as reports of German ships massing in northern ports filtered back, there was no immediate reaction by the Allies to speed up their own plans. On the 7th of April, 1940, British bombers spotted German ships heading toward Norway. They released their bombs, missed every ship, and headed home without calling for more raids. On the 9th of April, German air and sea forces converged on Norway. The British Navy managed to sink several German vessels in the northern port of Narvik, the most crucial location for the iron ore trade. But poor planning, a lack of coordination, and an unwillingness to commit enough troops eventually cost the Allies the Norwegian campaign.
Nothing really worked, symbolized for me by the British sending troops over, and the troops went on one ship and their supplies went on another. I mean, it was just impossible to wage war if you've got troops storming ashore without any rifles in their hands.
Britain decided to evacuate its forces to France to prepare for the larger battle soon to come. Norway was not lost. It was given away. Following the failed peace negotiations at the Vatican, Abwehr Chief of Staff Colonel Hans Oster still tried to assist the Allies and undermine Hitler. Oster had passed repeated, detailed warnings of the invasion of France in the Low Countries to the Allies through his friend Jes Bertus Sass, the Dutch military attaché in Berlin.
Sass and Oster had known each other since the early 1930s in Berlin. They shared the same disapproval for National Socialist policies. Colonel Oster found Sass to be a like-minded individual, and he supplied him time and again with internal information on German military strategies.
It was a case of the boy who cried wolf. They were telling them that the invasion is coming, and then it didn't come. But there had been so many postponements that by the time the invasion was actually to begin, people had begun to disbelieve the information.
Oster and Sass warned the Allies about the invasion of Denmark, which took place in the same day as the Norwegian campaign. No one listened. Danish troops were so surprised when the Germans crossed the border that the government surrendered within hours of the invasion. Ironically, there was so much valuable information leaking out of Germany from various resistance sources that the Allies failed to appreciate its significance.
There's a general rule, I think, in espionage that when information is easy to come by, it's not worth very much. Only if it's accompanied by blood, sweat, toil, and then it's likely to be real. When it just comes pouring at you, as it did from anti-Nazi sources in Germany to the Allies, they tend to disbelieve it. Not good enough.
Besides Oster's warning, the Allies had several other clues as to the time and location of the impending attack. In March of 1940, French intelligence received important documents from German double agents who were working for the Allies.
The German agents are given a questionnaire where it is said, check out the roads between Sedan and Abbeville, and the lines of communication, the rivers to be crossed, the carrying load of the bridges, the petrol depots on the way, and so on.
This new information didn't fit into the French military's neatly prepared plans.
We went to see the Army's superior headquarters to tell them that the attack would shortly come through the Ardennes. They made their headquarters study this possibility. Then their third bureau said, it is not possible that an armored force such as the Wehrmacht could cross the Ardennes without difficulties. It cannot be done. So they eliminated this possibility.
This brings up, I think, one of the greatest problems that any intelligence agency has, whether it's going back to the days of the Romans or its present day. How can you dissuade the policymakers of a government to abandon their mindsets, the policies that they themselves have crafted, even when they're faced with intelligence which says the answer is different, or should be different?
The French themselves had proven an attack through the Ardennes could work. During a 1938 war game near Sedan, a French officer attacked through the forest with a group of tanks and routed the opposition. The government had already spent so much money in the Maginot Line superfortress that the results of this armored attack were never published.
It was a question of people hiding their heads in the sand. It's ludicrous military tactics not to cover every possible base in terms of how somebody's going to come at you. They put all of their eggs in one basket. They decided the only possible invasion plan had to be based on the old Schlieffen plan, and therefore they were going to defend against that. But that left them unable to defend against anything else.
The invasions of Poland and Norway had given the Allies a clear look at the new age of mobile warfare. Modern forces moved quickly and coordinated their strikes using field radios. In fact, radio traffic in the Ardennes region was up sharply in the first days of May 1940. The location of the Luftwaffe's fighters and bombers offered yet another clue.
All of the bombers were in the north, and all of the fighter planes were in the south. And the fighter planes have one mission, and that is to protect the advance of the tanks and the troops along with the tanks.
Warnings from German resistance members, intelligence reports, and the location of enemy units all pointed to an attack through the Ardennes. However, Gamelin and the other Allied generals were still confident that the Maginot Line was the answer. On the 10th of May, silent German gliders landed atop the state-of-the-art fortress of Épinay-Malles in Belgium, along the protective Albert Canal. Using flamethrowers and special directional explosives, these elite German forces managed to neutralize most of the powerful turrets within 1 hour. The January plane crash at Mechelon had included plans of an airborne attack against this very fort. No special defensive measures had been taken. German ground forces used more trickery to capture several heavily guarded bridgeheads across the Meuse River in the north. They rode trains across the bridges dressed as civilians or as soldiers from other countries. Other groups at different crossings pretended to surrender.
The Germans tried ruses, and a dozen of them. And 10 of the ruses didn't work, but a couple did work. That's all they needed.
Panzers poured across the openings. Dorothy Huart was a 19-year-old girl living with her family near the city of Brussels. She remembers the abrupt end of the Phony War.
Most people, including us, didn't expect anything on the 9th in the evening. We slept quite fine until the first hours in the morning. Everything was normal. Then we started hearing frightening bombings. The shock was very violent. The first military event we saw was the arrival of the French army going towards Brussels to take its position.
Gamelin's grand maneuver had begun. In order to counter the advancing German ground troops, the very best Allied troops moved into northern Belgium. But the defensive positions they began to occupy were hardly worthy of an heroic stand.
You get the worst of both worlds. You still think you're being defensive, but you leave your defenses to move into uncharted territory and set up another defensive line.
As the French and British in the north readied themselves for what they thought was the main German attack, panzer divisions raced through the Ardennes forest to the south.
When the invasion of the West began, Hitler was secreted in a bunker near the western frontier of Germany. And when he learned from his intelligence reports that the Allies were going up into the northern part of the Low Countries, he jumped up and down for joy because he said, basically, they've bought our ruse.
Luftwaffe fighters destroyed many Allied planes on the ground. Due to this overwhelming air superiority, the panzer units were able to cross defended southern bridgeheads on the Meuse. As planned, the main thrust came through the French town of Sedan at the edge of the Ardennes forest. The Allies still had an opportunity to react. The Germans were advancing, but not as quickly as they'd hoped. Gamelin had time to send reinforcements to other defensive positions in the south, except he was still convinced that the main attack was in the north.
I think it was just a question of being so convinced of a military theory that you could not change your views on it, even when the evidence started piling up.
The French and British actually had more troops and tanks than the Germans. But the Allies chose to scatter their tanks randomly along the front for infantry support. They didn't have a concentrated armored column in order to launch a counterattack. The Germans pushed on, and the terrain beyond the Ardennes became more flat and open. The speed of the advance increased. French intelligence had tried to warn Gamelin of the enemy's interest in the roads between Sedan and Abbeville near the coast. Now the panzers were streaking across this very route. The West was in danger of collapsing. As the Battle of France began, Winston Churchill replaced Neville Chamberlain as Prime Minister. Chamberlain had tried to reason and negotiate with Hitler and had failed. Now a military-minded leader was taking over.
It's a fairly obvious statement to say, but I think I should still say that Chamberlain and Churchill were radically different people. Chamberlain was forced into war, and as a result of that, he had a major problem about the prosecution of the war because it was such an abhorrent thought for him. When Churchill takes over, you're seeing discernibly a more robust, pugnacious demeanour.
What kind of a people do they think we are? Is it possible they do not realize that we shall never cease to persevere against them until they have been taught a lesson which they and the world will never forget?
There was still very little that the new Prime Minister could do in the current battle. The speed of the German advance and Gamelin's inability to shift his forces to the south had left hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers trapped between the enemy and the English Channel. German soldiers had simply maneuvered around the vaunted Maginot Line. Most of its guns were not built to fire towards France, so it was decimated from behind. A vulnerable dinosaur from another era of warfare. The Panzer commanders were ready to make the final push to annihilate the enemy. But suddenly, the Germans stopped.
One of the great mysteries of the Second World War, that still really exists to this day, is why Hitler ordered the troops to halt in front of Dunkirk. It has never been satisfactorily explained.
The Allies had been working for years to crack the German cipher machine known as Enigma. The code was finally broken during the invasion, and British intelligence intercepted and decrypted the order from Hitler demanding that his generals stop.
Hitler wanted to prove definitively who was actually wearing the pants in the family. And that was the reason that he stopped the tanks and relegated the commander-in-chief to a bit player. In other words, Hitler won his power struggle, but he strategically lost the campaign.
Whatever the reason, this gave the Allies time to rescue the troops trapped at Dunkirk. Operation Dynamo began as boats of all shapes and sizes left England. British had hoped that 50,000 soldiers could escape the beaches alive. Even this seemed unlikely as the Luftwaffe appeared in force. But the ships kept coming. Undaunted by the damaging airstrikes, over 300,000 British and French troops were brought back to England. Hitler's chance to force a peace settlement had passed. In spite of the Allies' superior numbers, France had fallen in a matter of weeks. On the 19th of May, 1940, General Gamelin was relieved of his command. On the 5th of June, one day after the evacuation of Dunkirk, Daladier was ousted as premier. Charles de Gaulle, a longtime advocate of mobile armored warfare, became Undersecretary of Defense. The old leaders were gone and new ideas had emerged, but it was too late. France was lost.
The May 1940 German attack and the defeat, all that is sinister for us, French people, for me as an officer, for my colleagues. That's the greatest tragedy of our lives, to have seen that defeat. A whole country's disaster, millions of people with their horses, their bikes, their animals, their mattresses, all of them going to southern France. It is the most terrible thing.
It's been said that hindsight is 20/20, and it's easy to second-guess decisions made many years ago. Yet the Sitzkrieg period was filled with so many missed opportunities that it's hard to believe. What would have happened if France and Britain had provided Poland with immediate military assistance?
It doubtless would have been a victory, not only for the Allies, but for all of humanity, if the war could have been shortened to the winter of 1939 to 1940.
What if the French troops on Germany's western border had continued to advance during the Polish campaign?
The combined French-British forces missed opportunities of invading on the ground. They missed opportunities of countering in Norway. There were just so many times when better thought put into the process of really winning a war against Germany might have actually won that war. Instead, they sort of waited in a defensive way for Germany to actually make a further invasion, and thereby lost a lot of time and a lot of opportunities.
What if the German resistance had assassinated Hitler and negotiated a separate peace?
The greatest opportunity that the Allies could have hoped for would have been the fall of the Hitler regime.
What if the Allies had kept faith in Hans Oster and prepared for the exact day of the invasion?
If one is to draw some type of conclusion from the so-called Sitzkrieg or Phony War, particularly on the French side, there is nothing more dangerous for an army than inactivity.
What if the Allied leaders had paid attention to the many clues and strongly opposed the German advance through the Ardennes?
There are many lessons to be learned. Amongst them are, don't be obsessed with the last war that you fought.
What if the Allies had learned the lessons of Blitzkrieg and counterattacked with numerically superior concentrated tank divisions? The Allies were the obvious loser. But even Germany failed to fully capitalize on its opportunities during the Sitzkrieg. In keeping with the bizarre nature of the Phony War, the party that benefited most was not even directly involved.
I would say the real big winner during the Phony War period was Stalin, because He had made this pact with Hitler that not only allowed them to divide Poland, but which also allowed the USSR to take possession of the Balkan state and to amass an enormous amount of territory under their control, almost without firing a shot.
Perhaps the only positive result of the inactivity of the Phony War was that it gave Jean-Paul Sartre time to write Being and Nothingness. He also wrote The Age of Reason while being held captive after the fall of France. The information and opportunities were there for the taking, but they were either not recognized or they were ignored. And that is the real tragedy, the sorrow of the Sitzkrieg.